From Soviet to post-Soviet, the Yeltsin years, the wild 90s. There are still the continuing issues and problems to be addressed that Gorbachev tried to deal with during the reform and ultimately was unsuccessful in trying to address, and that led to the crumbling of the Soviet Union. And these are issues and problems that will remain constant till this day of what has to be dealt with, and these are difficult things to consider. For example, the past. Which past? What narrative will be used to house the national narrative? There are many, many histories, some that had been hidden, that need to be addressed. The press. How free will be the press? How free will the hand of the journalist be to uncover the truth? The environment. How contaminated was it, and how contaminated will the state still let it be? The republics. The republics were supposed to be a friendly republic of the Soviet states, and that proved to be a complete illusion. What will be the relationship between the republics now that there's not the Soviet relationship? The shadow of coercion, of violence, of fear that was so pervasive throughout the 20th century. What will be the role of coercion in this new Russian society, and how to deal with the past of violence? The economy is still broken. How to fix it? So even though the players may change and the shift to power may now be the White House rather than the Kremlin, the economy still remains something that needs to be addressed and fixed. Corruption? There was corruption, and there remains corruption. What to do about corruption? And this will be an enormous problem during the Yeltsin years, and will have enormous consequences for what comes after Yeltsin. Well, the Yeltsin years were a crazy time, and we'll be looking at them in various facets of politics, culture, society. But one of sort of the larger-than-life figures of the Yeltsin years is, of course, Boris Yeltsin. And he has his heroic moments, such as standing on the tank, and he has his ridiculous moments, like when he's dancing on stage. But the Yeltsin years are seen as an era of transition. The question is, the transition to what? Again, it reminds me of the poem by Yeats, that wonderful line that things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Once the Soviet Union collapses and the Kremlin no longer has the power, what happens as things fall apart? The Soviet Union is transformed, but into what? It's now the post-Soviet Union. Is it post-communist, post-socialist, post-Soviet? And if it's post, what is it going to become? Part of the goals of this now post-Soviet society was to try to create a market economy. But what does a market economy mean to this post-communist, post-socialist, post-Soviet society? There's lots of different kind of terms bandied about in terms of what the market economy means post-Soviet style. Crony capitalism, oligarchical corporativism, industrial feudalism, market-oriented democracy might have been the hope, but certainly was not the reality of what comes out of this era of transition. There are several Borises. There's Boris the Communist. And Boris the Communist, he started his upward trend towards getting himself entrenched into the Communist Party early on in life. He had pretty good credentials. He came from a poor peasant family, and he was a construction engineer, and he joined the party in 1961. Those are solid communist credentials. He had become the first secretary of Sverdlovsk in 1976. He becomes a full party member in 1981 to the Central Committee, and he keeps moving up the ranks, and by 1985 he's the reform candidate to clean up Moscow after all that corruption. But he's also humiliated and demoted. He's the first Soviet politician to not only publicly reject the Communist Party and his Communist Party identity, but to be rejected by the Communist Party and the communists in Soviet political life. So it was a huge humiliation, and Boris Yeltsin makes a huge comeback. And there's this personal political rivalry between Yeltsin and Gorbachev that will mark the collapse of the Soviet Union and plays a very important role, I think, in terms of what goes on between these two conflicting parties. When Yeltsin was removed in 1987, he was humiliated, and he received a very big demotion. And he was eager to humiliate Yeltsin. No, he was eager to humiliate Gorbachev. So there's Boris the communist, there's Boris the rebel. So Boris casts aside his bona fides of his communist credentials, and in March 1989 he wins an election to the Congress of People's Deputies and becomes a member of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and he runs as a reform candidate. He's an elected member of the RSVSR Supreme Soviet, and so he's seen as a sort of more liberal, outside reform candidate. And probably the moment he's most remembered for is his heroic tank moment in 1991 with the so-called coup that is still very much clouded with questions of just what kind of coup was it, and what was Gorbachev's role in it, and what was the whole intention of it anyway. But Boris Yeltsin proves himself to be the man of the hour by standing on a tank. So what is, I think, really interesting about Boris Yeltsin is that he starts out as a product of the Soviet system. He's very much this Soviet citizen, but he chooses to break with the system, and it was a choice he made, and ultimately becomes the principal leader of opposition to the Soviet Union, and plays, I think, a very important role in pushing the Soviet Union, the power of the Soviet Union, over the edge. I think that's very interesting. When you are first a member, then you're a member of the opposition, then you become a member, you become the head of the new party ruling over Russia. And his political position was much more radical and libertarian than many. So he gives a sort of contrary position where he's very much reform. He's ready to push things, but in his style and his sort of traditional political behaviors, he remains very much an authoritarian, and he very much reflects the sort of communist bossism of his generation, that he wants to appeal to the side of anti-corruption and being sort of radical and liberal, but he has a very difficult time shedding the communist ways about him. His political positions oftentimes are more negative than positive. The negative goals are more clearly articulated than his positive goals. He's anti-this and he's anti-that. It's what he's against. He's against Gorbachev, and he failed to really develop a coherent alternative plan to Gorbachev's perestroika, but because he stood up to the coup and he stood up on the tank, he is seen as the best candidate to take the Soviet Union into the post-Soviet Russia. And I think that's a key point, that Boris very much seemed very Russian. He was courageous, he was stubborn, he was unpredictable, he was a poor loser, he was a populist, he was an alcoholic, he was very fond of volleyball and tennis, and he made a much better rebel than a policymaker. Again, his negative goals, anti-this or anti-that, was stressed, so he had no real direction, no blueprint of really what should be done, and made some very poor decisions, and these will have enormous consequences. But there's also this very distinct difference between Gorbachev and Yeltsin that was striking. And Russians were getting tired of Gorbachev and his sort of non-Soviet, non-Russian ways. Gorbachev would hold hands in public with his wife and show affection to his wife, which was seen as positively not Soviet. Whereas Yeltsin, he acted like a true Russian, as in secondhand time, the quote goes, that Yeltsin needed a pickle and a shot of vodka first thing in the morning. Now that's Russian. So he could be something that people could quickly identify with as acting appropriately Russian. Again, you want to think about the importance of the rivalry between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Think about the role of the August coup. There's a couple of articles that we had for readings. One of the titles was about the coup that never was. Think about what was that all about. Was it just kind of a shake-up? And what was the intent of it all? It was a very curious episode, and it had dire repercussions for Gorbachev and his experiment, that's for sure. Yeltsin's Russia first position really resonated with Russians. And again, we're going to make the shift from the Soviet to the Russian position, because Yeltsin then is really going to push for Russia first, Russia nationalism. And with this idea of Russia first, Yeltsin nationalizes Soviet energy resources, which the legality was questionable. He also heads up the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, which included Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And these presidents met at a Belarus hunting lodge in December 1991 to nix the Union Treaty that sought to create a sort of Gorbachev version of a union, and essentially took the Soviet Union off the map with this creation of the CIS. And there's debates of how legal this move actually was. But whether it was very legal or not, communism was over, and there was now the time to draw up a new kind of political relationship. I'm going to briefly look at some of the key points of Yeltsin's presidency, and you might want to do some further reading on these. So initially from August 1991 to October 1993 is the time that the first Russian Republic is established and radical reforms are pushed for. Part of the radical reforms was privatization and what is sometimes called shock therapy, sometimes described as all shock and no therapy. And these efforts, particularly in 1992, was to sort of push Russia into a market economy by essentially pulling the rug out of all social services and government aid. All price controls ended, subsidies cut, the command economy was ended, terrible inflation up to 300% in January 1992. And it was just very painful. Economically, people were very, very vulnerable during these years. And the opposition grows, leading to this really strange alliance of the red and the brown, between the communists, or the red, and the brown, which is sort of the fascist nationalists. And that's not a good sign. Between October 1993 and August 1998, there's a crisis with the reform. It's going too fast. It's hurting too many people. And Yeltsin's power is becoming more arbitrary and of greater concern. And he's relying heavily on his family, just known as the family. And we'll look at also during this time where he begins to use the Chechen War as possibly a diversion. Also, in other key points of Yeltsin's presidency, there's another round of privatization. And with these rounds of privatization, Russia is essentially bought and sold, and the oligarchs pay for Russia and gain tremendous power. Between August 1998 and December 1999, Yeltsin retreats from the reform because of its popularity and instead stresses the need for stability. And Yeltsin is very much equating stability and security with his own power, hence the need to make sure he stays in power. We will continue the discussion of Yeltsin's presidency in the next video.